Hi guys, how are things? We're back to you today. Now we have a very, very dark story for you today. So we will say, if you are sensitive to, if you're sensitive to adult themes, we're talking about sexual assault today. And if you're like most of society that wants to put this under the carpet, you might not watch this. However, I would suggest that you do. So those of you that are staying with us, put your safety belt on and make sure you're buckled up because we're in for a rough ride. Hi Fiona, how are you?
Hi.
How are you today?
Oh no, not too bad.
Well, what we're going to do, we're going to cover this story. I'm sure people recognise Fiona. We're going to cover this story. I'm going to let you tell your story. So we're going to go back from the start because we all know how the story ended up. But when did this sexual abuse start, Fiona?
I think I was about 3 or 4. I remember I was carrying a cup of coffee, so I'd say I was closer to 4 because I was able to carry this cup of coffee upstairs, and my mother had said, take that up to your dad. And I went up with this cup of coffee and I put it on the locker, and my dad was looking at this deck of cards and it had pictures of different sexual positions.
Okay.
And he showed me a picture and he says, what do you think this is? And I said, in my innocence, the picture was actually a woman giving oral sex to a man.
Okay.
And I turned around and in my innocence I said, eating a sausage, Dad. And he kind of smirked at me a bit and he said, no, it's not. And proceeded then to make me give him oral sex.
So that was the start of it. And you know what, like even before you got to the stage where he made you perform oral sex, it's disgusting the thought of a 4-year-old or possibly even a 3-year-old child looking at these kind of cards. Now, what we have to understand here, guys, this is very, very important. This is real life. This happened, okay? And not only did it happen on that occasion, but it happened systematically. For how many years, Fiona?
I was 17.
17. So
stopped, yeah.
we're looking at possibly 14 years of this systematic routine sexual abuse. And it was not just one perpetrator. There was your dad and there was 2 other perpetrators. Isn't that right?
Yes, it was my uncle as well, and it was my dad's friend. He raped me as well, yeah.
Right, it's absolutely shocking. Now, can we move forward and how did you address this? How did it affect you going through your early teen years?
Not very well. Like I was quite lost.
Yeah.
I didn't know, first of all, how wrong it was. I started to learn how to parent my children. I didn't even know how to be a mummy. And I started doing parenting courses, and we learned about transmitted diseases and sexual advances and stuff like that. And as we were talking about different topics, it would always trigger something in me, like the STI. I didn't know I had an STI until I was 23.
Okay.
And it was being spoken about, and I went, that's what I had. I had genital warts, and I had them so badly I was operated on at 13.
So hold on, guys. Let's just go through that again. At 13 years of age, you were operated on for an STI.
Yeah.
And like, why was nothing done at 13 years of age?
I don't know, because I can't remember ever it even being said to me it was an STI. Even that was covered up. I remember my mother telling me I wasn't to tell school I was in hospital and why I was in hospital. But it was just my innocence, I suppose. So I didn't know myself that I had an STI.
Yeah. Your innocence, but the cover up from like behalf of your mother and stuff like that. And you know what? There's somebody out there performed that operation, a surgeon.
Oh yeah, and I've seen it. I've seen the documentation, and he wrote back to my family doctor, and in it said, I have dealt with this little girl. That's what he wrote, this little girl, and I have cauterized the genital warts that I had, and I've sent her off with cream, and he wrote on it, and I think that'll do the trick.
Yeah, that's absolutely shocking.
Yeah.
And you know, we discussed earlier before we were making the video how prolific we feel that sexual abuse is in Ireland. And don't get me wrong, guys, I am no fan of the regime that is the Catholic Church in Ireland. However, this is a case that has nothing to do with Catholicism or priests or anything like that.
Yeah.
So we must remember, because there's something that is projected quite a lot in Irish society now, that we believe once we hear the word sexual abuse that we instantly connect it to the church, don't we?
Yeah.
This is family. This is within, you know, a home where you should have been feeling safe,
Yes,
secure,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
minded. You were only a child. Now, like, I mean, this happened ritualistically and routinely. Like, I mean, it wasn't a once off or a twice off or
No,
whatever. It was routinely
Yeah,
happening.
it was nearly every day.
Part of life.
Sometimes twice a day. Yeah, and you see, I thought I was special. I thought I was the chosen one. So my father protected me from my mother, who looked at me as the other woman in the relationship, and she was very violent and aggressive towards me. So I was in this vicious cycle. But I didn't realise, and I didn't learn about paedophilia until I was in my 20s. I realised then that I wasn't the chosen one. I was the convenient one.
Yeah.
I was there on a platter, and that it was a disease. I didn't think that my father would go and look at another girl or want another girl.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was something between me and him.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to describe how brainwashed you can be
And
living
another
in
thing,
it.
yeah, and what we have to remember here as well, with a lot of cases of sexual abuse, maybe with paedophiles, there's a particular age group that you fit into,
Yeah.
and once that age group has passed,
You're no good.
yeah. But this happened like from the age of 3. You know, like, I mean, so you were groomed before you could have possibly known what paedophilia was.
Yeah,
It was just normal life.
Yeah.
That
I
was,
sacrificed.
yeah, absolutely.
And my mother was quite happy to sacrifice me. And I then knew I had to protect my sisters.
Yeah.
So if I thought my father was looking at my sister in a certain way or anything, I would make sure that they weren't within reach. I would nearly kind of offer myself.
Okay, because there was a protect. You wanted to protect.
Yeah, and I lived with an awful lot of shame, because I have visions of myself sitting on the stairs, waiting for a program to start. So it would be Charlie's Angels or Starsky and Hutch, and I'd be sitting on the stairs. I'd hear the music, and I'd shout down, "Dad, do you want your cup of coffee now?" But I was more or less saying, "Do you want to have me now?"
Yeah.
Because I was only little, but I had the sense to protect myself. And the way I protected myself was a certain program on the television I was able to watch. So I was able to disconnect to what he was doing to me.
Okay.
And watch over his shoulder or whatever. And
So this was
not be present in what he was doing.
This was a management mechanism that you developed yourself
Yeah,
along the way.
and
so
it was only afterwards I got kind of very proud of myself when I was seeing a counsellor.
Yeah.
I kept this very quiet because I carried a lot of shame for it, and I didn't understand it. I didn't see it as a little girl trying to protect herself and take her mind away. Like, I was very traumatized over certain things. Like, my father raped me in the cemetery one time.
Really?
Yeah, up against a tree. He took me down to my nanny and granddad's grave, and he dug the grave and tidied it up, and then went into a tree. And I remember him, I was standing up and he was raping me, and I was on guard as well. I was looking over his shoulder, making sure nobody could see. And I couldn't understand why nobody could see in this big open cemetery of Dean's Grange, see him doing what he was doing to me. And I have visions of myself then kind of happily skipping out of the graveyard.
Well, you know what, I've heard some really strange things in my time. I really have, and I've, as you know, we discussed. I've worked as a photographer, and I've done a lot of crime stories over the years. I kind of became pigeonholed at that, but in actual fact, I photographed your dad on one of his mornings, leaving Bray, going to court. But I have never heard anything that's absolutely horrendous. And it's interesting that you earlier used the terminology sacrifice, and it was sacrificial, and like, I mean, we can see that. And I'm not suggesting that it is satanic, but in essence, this is the worst crime that you could commit. To take the innocence of a child and to behave in such a manner. And I'm looking into the camera, and I'm telling you guys, you have to remember this. This is something that routinely and habitually happened. It's not a once-off. This became part of your life, and this is happening, I'm pretty sure, in Ireland today. Right now, as we speak, this is happening. And, you're a feisty person, so you learned how to fight back, and you learned how to shout out. But I believe that people that suffer at this kind of abuse, there's two ways to go. Either they become feisty, or they become very, very shy. And those people could be perpetual victims. Yeah. And you did say earlier on that you felt shameful about it, and I believe that there's two things that people use as a coercive measure to keep these secrets. One is shame, if they can project shame onto you, and the other, of course, is fear. Yeah. And you had both. You were living with both. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I remember I used to shoplift. Okay. Because I was responsible for my brothers and sisters. And I was also responsible for putting food on the table. Okay. And on top of all this. Yes. And I went out shoplifting one day, and I've actually found the file. And I was caught, and I robbed a pound of tea and a leg of lamb. So imagine me 7 years old, and I was brought down to the police station. And I was taken to the children's court in Dunleary. And the judge obviously thought, something's not right about this scenario here, and he requested for me to be assessed. Okay. And he says it was never done. So the alarm bells were ringing, but nobody was answering. Everywhere. Yes. Yeah. So everyone. I remember my teachers in school. They were doing a Stay Safe program. Okay. So this was brought out in the schools to teach children good touches and bad touches. Yeah. And I remember sitting there, and I remember thinking, is there talking to someone here? I already know about all this. And I thought I was clever. Yeah. And so clever that I was misleading my teachers. But in essence, really, it was there. Children didn't sit beside me because I smelt. Okay. And I smelt like, as an adult now, I know when you have a relation, if you're in a sexual relationship, most people get up and have a shower afterwards. Yeah. But as a child, I didn't know that. So I went around pretty smelly and dirty. But my mother had this ritual in the house. Every night when she'd go to put a wash on, she would count out the pairs of pants that was in the wash basket. And if I didn't rinse my pants before I put it in the wash basket, I would get a hiding. I mean, my mother would lose it, and I'd be called all the dirty bitches under the sun, and that one is a tramp. She's so dirty. Because my mother didn't want to see the evidence of what my father was doing to me. Yeah. And it was only years and years later, when I'm looking back at everything that went on, like the alarm bells were huge. Yeah, I have to say though, Fiona, that there has to be something wrong with an individual that puts the onus on a child to cover up the evidence of such behaviour. That's really sad. Yeah. It is really sad. And my mother was very disturbed, I have to say. Yeah, and I also think that you said how, like, at 7 years of age you were behaving like, I suppose,
you were running the house. And maybe that's something, now I just think, and of course I'm only an amateur psychologist, but for me psychologically that seems to make sense, because it kind of turns you into an adult. Yeah. And then of course the act of paedophilia isn't taking place. Yeah. And it might have been a realm that suited your parents because it was easier for them to rationalise it too.
I remember my mother lifting me out of the bed, actually physically lifting me out. I was that small. She was able to lift me out of the bed, put me into bed beside my father, and then she'd happily get into my bed. Okay. And I'd be sleeping in the room.
And what age might you have been at that?
I must have been about 5 or 6, because she was able to lift me.
Now, like, I mean, as you moved into your teenage years, there must have been a point where you knew that this was really, really wrong. Yeah. Because what we have to understand, and I'm sure people are looking at this and they're going, you must have always felt it was really wrong. She didn't, because it happened so young. Isn't that right? Yeah. So there was a large amount of years, probably 9 or 10 years that this went on before you start going, do you know what? This isn't happening in every house on the street. Yeah. And this isn't normal. And this is really wrong. But at the point where you decided this is really wrong, did you realise that your life could have been at risk? Yeah.
When I hit, say, 14, 15, I was really starting to, I was developing. I was getting periods. I was embarrassed. I didn't want my daddy seeing me on my time a month. I didn't want him, and my breasts were developing and him touching me and everything. I didn't want that. And I started really rebelling against it all. And as I said, my mother then went to England, because my mother had actually told the authorities what my father was doing. And then she took my sisters and my brother and went to England. I woke up one morning and they were just gone. And I was left with my father, and he moved me into the bed full time. Okay. So I was actually his wife then for months as we were decorating the house. And I felt so abandoned by my mother, because there was no concern for me. I woke up and they were just gone. No goodbye.
Abandoned.
Yeah.
Abandoned.
Yeah.
And abandoned by, you know, it's one thing to be abandoned by somebody that doesn't know what's going on in your life, but to be abandoned by someone knowing what they're leaving you in.
Yeah.
And what I must ask you though, what age would you have been then, roughly?
I was 16.
Okay, so 16 years of age. And your mother went to the authorities before she left?
Yeah. She had caught my father in the bed with me one of the nights. She kicked us out and we went to stay in a friend's house. And my father got into bed with me. I was crying. I was in bed crying because my mother kicked me out. I was head of the debate team in school, and I was looking forward to going in the next day for the debate. And I knew I wasn't going to school the next day. This was ritual. My mother was always, I was my father's whore. So if they had a row and she kicked him out, he was to take his whore with him. So I was often brought out in the car. I remember my dad having sex with me in the car up in Killiney Hill, up in the mountains, if my mother would kick me out, or driving around in the car with him for a day or two with no money, no dinner, no nothing. I was always the centre of their rows. So yeah, I've lost track now because I get so involved in it.
Well, the thing is, it's very understandable that you get lost in it, because it's not like I'm asking you to recount 1 or 2 occasions. It's your life day in, day out. Yeah. And like, I mean, I have to be honest, I knew a lot of what went on, but I didn't realise how ritualistic it was. I really didn't realise that it was to that extent. Like, I mean, this is absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
You know, it's, and what I must, you know, I have to point out, and I know I've said it before, but we have to remember we're talking about a child. This, you know, this was a child that was being treated like this. And your mother went to the authorities before she went to the UK. But was there a knock on the door?
No, I didn't know this.
Yeah.
I actually did not know that my mother did this until I fought to have her arrested. After my father was arrested and sentenced, and then I had to appeal the leniency of his sentence, and then when I'd done all that, I went back then and I thought, well, why didn't you just go after my mother? Why didn't you investigate her? And they said it was too hard to prove. And I wrote to Noreen O'Sullivan then, and I said my mother should be charged with aiding and abetting. It's done in every other crime, and why isn't it done now for her?
Absolutely.
So she ordered my mother to be investigated, and my mother was brought in and questioned.
Yeah.
And it was in her questions when the detective asked me to, was there anything I wanted to ask? And I said, yes, ask my mother about the time she caught my father in the bed with me. And her brother was with her. So this was all around the whole family, all knew this was happening. And my mother went to a place, a mental health facility that was involved with our family.
Okay.
For years they were involved. And my mother, I found a document where my mother actually went and told them that she caught my father in the bed with me, and that I'd had an STI when I was 13, and that she believes I was being sexually abused.
And what was the response to that, Fiona?
There was none.
None whatsoever.
They could have easily come and got me, but they didn't. And in the meantime, so she went in the October, November of 1982. Then that man whose house that we had stayed in then came and raped me in my home. Now, the questions that that has arisen for me is, how did he know I was at home on my own for him to come and rape me? How did he know that it was safe for him to rape me in my house and he wouldn't get caught? I believe it was organised. It was to shut him up and keep them quiet for what they knew. Yeah. And then that was in the November. So that Christmas, my father had beaten me so badly that Christmas. And the worst thing for me, and I still remember, was he broke my record player. And that was the worst thing.
Yeah.
That was the only...
Because that was probably your psychological escape.
Yeah. And I could still see him now. He kicked it and smashed it.
Yeah.
All because I wanted to go to the roller disco in Dunleary.
Okay.
And
where was that? Probably in the top half, was it?
That was it, yeah. And I had gone up, it was New Year's Eve, and I had gone up to the bus stop, and next minute he arrived up. And get into the car, you fucking whore. It was me and my brother, and I got into the front of the car, and he boxed me straight into the face. And he goes, you're going to no fucking disco. What do you want to go to a disco for? You want to tramp around, you're nothing but a tramp. And those words, I've always been called a whore and a tramp and everything. And he brought me home and he gave me such a beating. And I was left, I remember just lying in my bed crying. And I knew then I had no escape, that I was going to die. They'd kill me rather than let me tell or escape all this. So I went into my mother's room and I found every tablet I could find and I took them. Okay. And I lay back in the bed waiting to die.
Yeah.
And it was my brother who came up the stairs to check on me.
Yeah.
And I think I told him then I took the tablets. And he went and got my mother. And I remember my mother screaming at my father to call an ambulance. And my father said, no, let her fucking die.
Really?
Yeah. And my mother gave me black coffee and made me sick. And then that night, New Year's Eve, I was brought down to that man's house that had raped me to babysit his daughter while all the parents went out for New Year's Eve.
That's like, you know what, I said a few minutes ago, I have been so shocked, but I'm even more shocked now. And because, and I say it again, this is reality, guys. You couldn't make this up. Like this, you know what? If Stephen King was sitting in this room now, he couldn't make up a story.
I've
like
tried
this.
suicide twice.
And what age did the suicidal ideation start at?
Well, look, I was 16 then, the first time, and the second time was I was about 23, and my first marriage had broke up, and it broke up because of the pressure of my abuse. Like, I got married in 1990, and I only told somebody for the first time about my abuse in 1988. So I was seeing a social worker, and she was probing me and wanting the details. So she got me a psychologist.
Okay.
So I was attending this psychologist, and I wasn't coping with being married and being with my husband and having children. I'd had my first child, my parents took and adopted. I then had another two. Then I met my husband, and I was pregnant for him. And I just wasn't coping. I wasn't coping with being a parent, with being a wife. I just felt I wasn't worth anything.
And of course, you probably didn't know what a real relationship was meant to be. You didn't know, because your life, you've been exposed to this all the time, and then you go, and what's after this?
Yeah.
So it's very understandable. It makes total sense. In actual fact, you know, if you be a little bit easier on yourself and look at stuff retrospectively, you handled stuff very, very well, because you weren't getting support. You were getting to see people that were supposed to be giving you support, but you weren't actually getting support.
Yeah.
You were just getting case closed.
And I told them, you know, when I tried, my marriage broke up and I tried the second suicide attempt, I was in Lockhamstown Hospital, and I believed my children would have been better off. I believed that I was to blame and I was not worth anything, but my children didn't deserve me.
Yeah.
They needed proper parents, and that I needed to just go and leave my children to be reared by parents.
Yeah.
And my husband had left me, and I couldn't see any future. I was struggling. I was attending this psychologist. Everything was falling apart, and I just again took a load of tablets, and I had my stomach pumped in Lockhamstown Hospital. And I told him I was sexually abused, and I don't know how to live. I didn't know how to survive.
Yeah.
And they just patched me up and let me out. And I continued seeing my psychologist, and then he got transferred away. And then I got brave enough. My social worker encouraged me to talk to the police. And I then worried about the child that I had, that my parents adopted.
Okay.
And I believe my mother thought that this child was actually my father's. My first child was born with no fingers. And again, that fed into, I can't do nothing right. I can't even have a baby right.
Mm.
Like, she was born with no fingers. Like, even that, I couldn't do it right. I had a very traumatic birth, delivery, and I just felt numb, that I was just not worth it. And the social worker then encouraged me to speak to the guards, because my daughter that my parents took had hit 3, and that was the trigger for me.
Yeah.
And she turned 3 in the March, and the April I went into Hollis Street, because I was now pregnant on my 3rd child, and I was being questioned about my previous history. So I had to say, well, I have my first child isn't living with me, and I had to go through it, and I just started crying. And the nurse said, is there something wrong? And I said, well, I was sexually abused, and that was the first time it came out of my mouth. So she called the social worker straight away.
Was the relief came as soon as you said that?
No. Fear. Huge fear. They left me in a room on my own and I was crying. And I thought, what the hell have you done? What have you done? You've let this out. But of course, anyone knows it. You open this can of worms and you just can't put the lid back on.
You can't.
You try.
And you probably would have if you could have.
Yeah, I would have done.
Point. Yeah.
So Hollis Street wrote to Bray and then I got a social worker. So then she comes into the mix.
Yeah.
And that was in 1988. And she was then trying to get me to come out about it. She asked me questions. She'd ask about my brothers, my sisters, were they abused too? She'd ask me about the history of it. And then she raised the issue of me talking to the police. And that was after my second suicide attempt. And I just thought, I've got to do something to protect that child that they have up there.
Yeah.
And the social worker organised 2 guards to come to the house and I gave my statement. And I remember thinking, how do you put what has gone on for 16 years into words on a piece of paper? How?
You can't, can you?
Yeah.
You
I
actually
was so stressed and worried about it. And the social worker says to me, Fiona, don't worry about it. They will come back and they'll ask you different questions. They will help you. They will go off and they'll be in touch with you. And they didn't. They took the statement.
I have to ask you this question because, you know, the authorities, this had been flagged with the authorities on numerous occasions. Did you even feel when you were putting this to paper, sure, it doesn't matter because nothing's going to be done about it? You must have felt like that.
Yeah, I just felt I wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
I felt that so many people were ignoring me that I think I nearly believed that I was mental.
Yeah.
That I was the problem.
Yeah.
And that people were looking at me as if I was mental.
It's probably easier for you to believe that.
Yeah.
And also, for 2 reasons. One, it's probably easier for you to, at the time, to rationalise it like that. And also, we must remember that there was this negative reinforcement since you were 3 years of age, constant.
Yeah. But then there was also then this mother's instinct to protect that child that they had. So I was being torn.
Yeah. Tug of war.
Yeah. Like I didn't want to let it out, but I had to protect that child.
So the protection of others is really what made you stand out in the end.
Yeah, she was turning 3 and that's what I needed to do. And then I never heard from them again until they obviously went to my father because it was in within a couple of weeks of me making that statement that all my windows in my house was put in.
Okay.
So I was a single mother. My husband had just walked out. I was going to court fighting for maintenance. He would want the custody of my child, using my past as a reason to get the custody of my child. And then my family came down and smashed all my windows.
Yeah.
And I just had made this plan. They weren't getting my son. And if a judge ordered my son to be taken from me, I was going on the boat that night. I was doing a runner with my children. But a judge didn't. And the social worker stepped in and had me moved out of the vicinity of my parents. And I thought then the investigation was going to happen into my past. But I didn't. They never came back and questioned me, never asked me a question. And then I think I was in my new house for about a year or so. And they knocked the door and said, there's no prosecution to your father due to lack of evidence. They never even came into the house. I remember I was just standing at the front door and I closed the door when they left and I just gave out a big sigh of relief. And I thought...
And why were you relieved, Fiona? Do you feel like you were actually putting the lid back on this kind of worms now?
Yeah, and it's like you've got to deal with this yourself as best you can. So the only thing I could do was to go back and apologise to my parents for going to the police so I could keep an eye on my child that they had and watch her.
So let that sink in there, guys, because there's a little bit to unpack with that. So you actually went and apologised to your parents for a life of being habitually raped, just so you could keep an eye
on my child.
On your child.
Yeah.
Hey guys, you have to really let these elements sink into your brain, because it's very, very hard it's very easy to skirt over this, but this is real life. And I know I keep saying this, but this, like, I mean, how long are you dealing with a life like this at this stage, from 3 years of age to?
I was 23, 24.
So possibly 21 years of dealing with this kind of atrocities on a daily basis. Now, I'm sure there's people, and for good reason, that they should feel very lucky when they're watching this. I'm sure there's people that have woken up this morning, they've hit their toe off the bed, they've gone down, their car hasn't started, and they're going, why is everybody out against me? The world's against me, you know. So guys, realise that internally we have this ability to continue on, because this is what you did. You continued on. And another thing that I have to say, you can be a brave person, because you're brave, right? You can be a brave person and still be fearful of things, okay? Because there's elements of fear that you brought with you from 3 years of age that you never really were able to shake loose. When did you shake that fear loose?
God, you won't believe this story. I decided, right, I realised I was such an angry person. And then I fell into this job where I was able to use my anger as a job. I became a bouncer. Okay. I became head of security in a nightclub. Okay. And I used my anger as a job. Yeah. And I began to control my anger because I needed it as a job. And did you find that somewhat cathartic then? Yes. Yeah. I was in a relationship with a deadbeat. You wouldn't believe it, right? The man I picked was unreal, because I thought that's what I deserved. And I was in this relationship with a man who was obviously doing the dirt on me. And I told him, I was always honest. I told every man I got involved with about my past, but they would twist it. Mm-hmm. And it was a stick I gave them to beat me over the head with. Yeah. But this man had told another woman that I had given my children to my father to rape. So I went up to his farm and I set it alight in the middle of the night. And I came down, and as you know, in Bray, I was living in Old Court, I could hear the fire brigade going on. Now, I felt so powerful coming down from his farm, and they say, like, revenge is powerful. Yeah. And I'd set fire to his farm, and I got into my house, and I had 4 sleeping children. And when I heard that fire brigade going, it was like a light bulb moment, and I thought, oh my God, I could be arrested for arson. If I go to prison, what's going to happen to my children? My children only had me. Yeah. So I realised then that I had to do something about myself. Yeah. I had to fix me. I guess that was it was kind of a double-edged eureka moment, because you realised that you had this power inside you, that you could do this, but you also realised that you had children that needed you to be here. Who were relying on me. Yeah. They were relying on me for everything. Yeah. And they say, you know, like most victims of abuse would be turned to drugs, turned to drink. They'd have some vice. I hated me. And I mean, I hated me. And that was your voice? Yeah, I went down the road of cosmetic surgeries. I thought I needed to be fixed, and I started fixing the outside. And you thought that would fix the psychological elements? Yeah. So I went and I had a tummy tuck. I had my boobs done. I was used as a model, because I then got called by the papers the glam bouncer. And there was pictures of me in Sunday World. Oh yeah, I remember that story in Sunday World, actually. And because of I was then like the front page for this cosmetic company, and I thought I was amazing.
And was it fixing you for a short period of time?
Yeah, you'd be on this high.
Yeah.
It was like somebody going on the drink.
Yeah.
I was on this high.
Yeah.
And then I met Jim, my lovely husband. Yeah. And we were like two broken people. Jim himself, and he doesn't mind me saying it because I've wrote about it in my book. Jim had a drink problem. Yeah. And we came together, two very broken people, and we could have exploded and caused so much chaos, but we didn't. We saw the beauty in each other
and fixed one another.
And when Jim decided to come off the drink, and he did it himself, and I saw the strength in him, and I used to look at him and admire his strength, and I thought, well, if you can fix yourself for me, I can fix me for you.
And Jim, guys, I know Jim going back over 25 years, and of course I know him as Odd Job, okay? And if you're too young to know who Odd Job is, go and take a look at the Sean Connery James Bond movie, and you'll understand why he got that nickname. He's like myself. He's a big old dude, right?
Picnic.
And you know, he's a big guy, real strong guy. You know, strong physically and mentally. You know, and he proved that when he came off the drink, right? So, how did we get to court?
I had a phone call. It was my daughter, and she goes, "Mommy, I'm up having a row with Nanny." And I went, "Oh." So anyway, I rang my mother, and I said, "Will you please leave my daughter alone?" And she's not coming to your father's birthday party. So my father was turning 60 at the time. So this would be August in 2010.
Okay.
And I just turned around. I got real brave and brazen, and I said, "Why would my daughter go to the party of the man who sexually abused her mother?" And my mother says, "Well, you did well out of him then, didn't you?" And hung up. And I sat there, and my shoulders dropped, and Jim was sitting facing me, and I cried. And I said, "Jim, I cannot rear another child in this. I've got to do something about my father. I cannot have my father die. He's 60. I cannot have this secret go with him." Which I couldn't, because if he died, I was lost.
It's pointless.
Yeah.
Everything. And I would say this, what happened there too, I think, is this time the can of worms, it was opened by somebody else.
Yeah.
So it wasn't your job to put the lid back on.
Yeah.
You know, and you were able to run with it then.
Yeah, I remember I had all these A4 sheets of paper under my bed, and I had written a lot of my past down to hand to my daughter, because my daughter at 14 years of age came to me and asked me how Grandad sexually abused me, and I told her yes, and I couldn't explain to her, couldn't sit down and look in her face and tell her what happened. So I wrote it down and I gave it to her to read. So my kids knew. So at that particular time, I remembered all this writing I had under my bed, and I went and got it out, and I went to a friend of mine who turned it into an email. She put it all in an email, and I sent it to the sexual assault unit in Harcourt Street, thinking I'd never hear from anyone. And then I got a phone call from a detective, and she says to me, she explained who she was and that she'd read the email, and she says, "Your case is going to be sent to Dunleary. It has to go back to the area where you lived when the abuse happened," which was something I didn't know. And I thought, wow, you must have read something that's making you believe me.
Yeah.
I was shocked that this was happening, that someone was believing me. And she says to me, "You'll be contacted by a detective who will then take your statement.
Yeah.
So I was.
Because, guys, you must remember, this had been going on decades at this stage.
Yeah.
And every single time, case closed,
Yeah.
nothing happened. And now you had somebody,
A detective,
a
yeah.
detective, coming back to you and going, you know,
Yeah.
we're gonna look into this. At least you've now someone that's going to look into it. And people will only look into stuff that they believe. So it must have been, a great moment for you, was it?
It was, in a sense.
Bittersweet.
Because, yeah, I remember meeting him, and he was very young. And at that stage, I still carried shame. And I thought, how can I tell this strange man? Intimate. How, like, it's also intimate and private. Yeah. How do you explain it? Mm. And I was sweating. Mm. And Jim was sitting with me, and I was shaking. And again, I thought, how can I put it into a statement? Mm. How do I do that? How do you break it all down? And he asked me to explain it all to him. And I was cringing, absolutely. And I asked for a break. He asked for a break. And I said to him, he says to me, I have a headache. And then I felt guilty. Mm. And I thought, I'm bringing all this dirt into your life. Mm. So that's what I thought I was doing. I was planting dirt in someone else's life.
So you're still carrying this shame,
yeah.
You know.
And we had to take a break then.
And did you have an element, like, there's so much of this that went on, like, I mean, it was, like we said, it was systematically happening. Did you have an internal sense where you go, well, I need to include this and I don't include this, or I don't?
I was panicking. I think I hounded him. Yeah. Because I worked out, I asked him for an email address. And we cut the interview down into 2 halves, so it took, I think, 3 hours. And then a second 3 hours, so 6 hours trying to tell him everything. And then I asked him for an email address, and I go off and I didn't tell him that, and I have to explain this, and I have to tell him about I would have gone to a beach, and I forgot to tell him the time he raped me on the beach, or I passed a cemetery, and I have to tell him about that, and I'd go back and I'd email him. I hounded the poor job. Yeah. I don't know how he didn't tell me to get lost, but anyway. So this went on, and then he went and he approached my family, and my brother and my sister, and everybody denied it. My mother denied it, and my father, of course, denied it, and Fiona was nuts, and sure, she's doing this all the time, and sure, she spoke to the guards before and they didn't believe her. And I remember then the detective asking me about my previous complaint, and he says, Fiona, I'll have to go looking for that, because if you've made a complaint before and your father was arrested, we can't arrest him a second time. Yeah. So he went looking for the complaint, and he came back to me and says, I can't find it. And at that particular moment in time, that was good news for me. Yeah. Because then they could investigate him a second time. Yeah. And I never thought any more about it. And then my father then turned around and did a U-turn after, it started in 2010, and in the July of 2012, so it was going on 2 years, my brother decided that he was going to fess up and tell the truth, and went to the detective and told the detective what he knew. Yeah.
So the families, and I've seen this happening before, not in cases as severe as this, but I have seen it happen where a family has a dark secret and the family circles the wagons, and the individual that's causing the problem is what is the term they like to use, is ostracised. You can nearly imagine it happening on the plains of Africa with a herd. Someone's put out of the herd and they circle around and it's ostracised. But he had that clarity of thought and he came forward.
Yeah. And I couldn't believe it. And I remember ringing the detective and going, he's going to talk. He's going to tell you. He was the first bit of evidence. He was my evidence. And of course, you can imagine what life was like. I was always on the edge, always sick feeling in my stomach, always dreading it, always, I was a liar and how will I prove this? And, you know, I was just beating my head against a brick wall. And then my father then, when he heard my brother had gone to the police and told the police what he knew, my father did a complete U-turn and asked my brother to bring him down to the guard station in the August. And he went down and made a statement and said, yeah, he was guilty of it.
Yeah. So guilty of it, guys, let's just highlight that. Guilty of it means a ritualistic abuse from the age of 3.
Yeah, there was 13 sample charges.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get my head around, only 13 charges? How's that?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But the detective had to explain to me that there were so many charges that they had to break it down to what's called a sample charge, if I'm right. And I remember sitting in Dundee Court and we'd heard all these cases of shoplifting and car offences. And I'm sitting there and my father's behind me and I'm waiting on it to be called, waiting on my case to be called. And I was dreading it because all these people, the court was full.
Yeah.
I don't want all these people know my business. And then the court adjourned for lunch and I went outside and I remember saying to my husband, I can't, let's get back early. I can't have him sitting behind me. I just couldn't do with it. And we got back into the court early and I sat in a position where he couldn't sit behind me and I was sitting looking at him. And I was there till about 4 o'clock that day and all the cases were heard and mine was the last. But there was one strange guy sitting in the court as well. And my father got called and he stood up and the judge said, you've 100 and something charges here, but we've broke it down. There's 7 sample charges and you're going to be served with the book of evidence. And as they read out each charge, my father would have to say guilty. But I remember this guy that was also sitting there and he was going, what? Because he was shocked at what he was hearing.
This.
Yeah. And I'm cringing.
Yeah.
Because he's looking around and I'm the only woman left in the courtroom. So obviously I was the victim. And this guy was looking at me and I just, it was overwhelming. Yeah. And my father was given the book of evidence.
And it would be very unusual to have something like this to come in front of the courts because, correct me if I'm wrong, but sample charges, it's something that happens in the courts when the combined collective is too great to go through all the charges.
It would have taken too much time. Yeah.
So you could have like people that's in the court there, you could even have judges there that have never come across this in their entire career. You know, it's such an anomaly. Yeah.
So it then got referred into the Central Criminal Court it went straight to sentencing because he pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
So I was kind of relieved a bit. I was spared a trial.
Yeah.
So I was then told to do the victim impact statements. And I was given a date for court, which was January. And like I said, I was pretty upset because I was going to spend the Christmas with this. And I had to write my victim impact statement over the Christmas. And
that must have occupied the whole Christmas, did it?
Yeah, it was just, it consumes your life. It was everything. And I couldn't get to January quick enough. Get by the Christmas. I didn't care about Santa coming for my son. That sounds terrible, but that's where I was.
You just wanted to get it done.
I needed to get to January.
Yeah. I
wanted to survive to January. And I was still working, still bouncing as well through all this. And I got to court in the January and I got told then, firstly when I got in there, that I mightn't get a hearing that day.
Okay.
And I just thought, you are not doing this to me.
I want this done today.
Yeah, I physically couldn't do it again.
Yeah.
So the judge heard the case that day and then he adjourned the sentencing for a week because he wanted reports on my father's health. Didn't matter about my health, he wanted reports on his health. And so I had to go away and go back the following week. and we were in court then for sentencing the following week, and my father got 12 years with 9 suspended, and then he got released on bail for the final 3, and that's when the shit hit the fan.
So you went home?
Yeah, he went home, and I just crumbled. You know, I thought,
Talk about having the rug pulled from beneath your
Yeah.
feet.
you just think it just feeds into how you feel about yourself. I just thought, I'm not worth a day in prison. I'm just not worth it.
So, like, I mean, you were let down by your family, you were let down by the system, now you were let down by the courts because this man came in and pleaded guilty. And yet,
And he was patted on the back for doing it.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
and yet no punishment.
Yeah. And I remember
So it
the
makes
judge
you think,
saying,
what is the value of the
Yeah.
victim, doesn't it?
yeah,
Yeah,
the judge complimented him for having a job,
yeah.
and never complimented me for surviving it, but spoke about his good character.
Yeah.
He actually said, you've got good character, and they bailed him.
Yeah.
And I just crumbled. And that's when I remember leaving the courts. It's a bit of a blur now because it just went haywire, and I was surrounded by these reporters and everything, and I was crying, and I was embarrassed. I was crying in public.
Was this this must have been your lowest moment in all of it, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I remember saying, I'm not worth it. I'm just not worth it. Why am I not worth it? And I cried walking down the road, and the reporters were all following my father. He was on the other side of the road. And if you remember the Central Criminal Courts, there was cars beeping at us, there was reporters running out. It was chaos.
Yeah.
And I was crying, and I remember my son shouted over to my father, "You're a fucking..." And I went, please don't, let's just go. Because I just felt so worthless. I felt like I didn't want my kids fighting my battle either.
And what you must understand, like, people that are watching this interview, what they must understand is you had spent decades feeling worthless, right? And then you get to court, your father pleads guilty, and really what happened was the court said, yeah, you're right, you are worthless, because there was no punishment. And that's how you must have felt leaving that day.
Yeah.
You know, you must have said, well, do you know what, everybody's saying it now. So how did we get through this?
Well, I drove all the way, made Jim take me all the way home, down to our little haven here in Gorey, and I hid, pulled the curtains and hid. And I just thought, I can't do it, can't face the world, can't do anything. And then I start seeing the newspaper articles. I start seeing my kids. My daughter rang me and she says, "Mum, I have to get a phone call from it was a television program, and they want to interview me, and I want to do it." And then my 2 sons met with a reporter for The Independent, and they did it, and I thought, my kids were taking up my fight. They were just, I was falling, and they were just taking up my fight.
And Fiona's society embraced it as well.
Yeah. Bray, everybody, the public were all talking about me, and there was a walk in Bray organised. There was all these marches. There was a march in Dublin, and strangers were fighting for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Didn't even know me.
Like, I mean, I'm from Bray, as you know, and we remember it going on at the time, and there was such a strong community feel about it, wasn't there? Mac is behind the camera there, and I don't know how Mac didn't start crying in some of this video when we were making it. Fair play to you, because I could see the eyes getting a little bit watery, but there was a huge sense of community, and I've never seen the likes of that in Bray before that or since that.
Yeah, it's never happened because the pressure on the judge, which was Judge Carney, the pressure on him was enormous. Like, it was spoke about in the government buildings. Everybody was talking about my case.
Yeah.
And I was actually gone to counselling. my counsellor rang me and asked to see me, and I went into counselling very broken. And then when I'd finished, Jim came to get me, and we went for a cup of coffee. And I was sitting in this coffee shop, and I could see people looking at me. Kind of, I felt they were looking at me with pity, and I just wanted to hide, but we were trying to do something normal, like have a cup of coffee. And then I heard it on the radio. It was late in the evening, and I heard that my father's bail was being revoked. It was the first time ever that happened.
Yeah.
And they were bringing him back in the next morning to revoke the bail and send him to prison. And I remember thinking, I've got to get a babysitter. The mammy things started kicking in, and I need to get a babysitter, and I need to organise the house so I can go to court tomorrow.
You wanted to be there.
And the detective told me I didn't have to be there, that it didn't really involve me.
Yeah.
And I said to him,
do you reckon?
I've come this far.
Yeah.
I am going to see him go through those doors. Yeah. I deserve that.
Yeah, you did, yeah.
And I went to court the next day, and Judge Carney gave me a very half-hearted apology.
Yeah.
And sentenced my father. And on the day, the court was chock-a-block. And my father was brought in by his barrister. This is how stupid it was. And I was sitting in the court. My father was nearly put sitting beside me. And Jim turned around to the bars and goes, "Don't you fucking dare." And he brought my father off somewhere else to sit down. And the case got called. And I remember there was a barrister in my way. I wanted to watch Carney. I wanted to look in his eyes. Yeah. And I said to the barrister, "Excuse me, can you get out of my way? This is about me."
Yeah.
And your man just looked at me and stepped out of my way. And I stared at Judge Carney. I mean, I looked him in the eyes. And I just felt like, I need you to feel this. Yeah. I need you to feel.
Because this was your moment.
Yeah. And he told my father anyway that he was going to be locked up. And I stood up, and I stood there. And everybody went around by their business and running by me and going out. And I stood there and I watched him, my father, go through those doors. And that was my moment.
And Fiona, that was a moment that Ireland said, "You matter." That's what that was. And I have a story about that. I was outside your father's house that morning, and I was the first photographer there, and I hid in the back of the Jeep, and I wanted to get my photographs. And another photographer from the Herald arrived. He didn't even know I was there, and I'm still sure to this day he wonders where the second set of photos came from. But if I remember correctly, a black Mercedes pulled up to bring your father first, and your dad came up, and he wouldn't take him.
That's right, I heard that.
And that speaks quite a lot of volume about the community in Bray at the time, the support that you had. So he drove off, and they were waiting then for another 5, maybe 10 minutes, and a black Ford Transit came. Yeah.
He was late for court, and I was sitting in the coffee shop in the courts. Yeah. And I was sitting with the detective, and I happened to be telling the detective the chaotic few days I'd had, and how things were going and everything. And he says to me, he says, "Your father's going to be late." And I said, "Why?" He said he had to get an escort out of the estate. Everybody came out, and the taxi told him to get out. He wasn't taking him.
Yeah, he wouldn't take him. I remember as clear as day. A black Mercedes pulled up, and he wouldn't take him. And because of the delay, then things started to heat up a little bit in the estate as well. Because there was great community support for it. So, what would you say, Fiona? Because not everybody that's suffering this kind of sexual abuse, and we could have minors or whatever. What would you say? What do you do?
There is always life after it.
Yeah.
And life after justice is far better than life before.
Yeah.
You know, it's so, and I understand how hard it is to report it. And I understand you could be dropping a bomb into your family, but it needs to be done. This needs to be told. Your story needs to be told, and you're worth it.
Yeah.
You're worth the justice.
And I think that's very important to let anyone that may watch this that could be suffering some sort of abuse, you are worth it, because I firmly do believe that the two biggest tools the perpetrators play in this game is to devalue you and to instill fear. And with those two tools, if they can install those into your software, they have total control over you.
Yeah. I walked out of that court that day on air.
Yeah.
I had protected that child. I had now told what that child went through, and I have got justice for that child that I was. And for some reason, when I walked out of that court, my shame was just gone. And I can tell anybody my story. I do not carry 1 ounce of shame anymore. I might get upset and I might get teary and I might cry, but that's not shame.
No.
And I will tell. And that's what I want for every victim of abuse. I want you to feel the life of no shame.
That's really important. And you know what I would say that anyone that's in this situation now, and I know that people that suffer sexual abuse do feel shame, okay?
Oh, yes.
And they feel like they are the shame of Ireland, but the reality is this is not the shame of Ireland. This is Ireland's shame.
Yes.
And the system has let you down.
Yeah.
Everything. And it is, and I have to say this, shame on Ireland.
Yeah, because, you know, my story was so hard to get across, and there were so many twists and turns, and so many people knew, and so many people in authority knew, and now I found so many files proving what I'm saying, and it's just shocking. And the thing is, people will not believe it. That they'd rather think I'm crazy and that my story is not true than believe my story and believe that this could happen.
Yeah.
And anyone coming out that tells you their story, it is true. They're telling the truth. Because just because it sounds shocking and unbelievable doesn't mean it's not true.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And like a big concern that I have is the 21st century Ireland that we live in now leads people to believe that you will be believed, but you may not be. You might have to go and start shouting still.
Yeah.
Do you know what? Not that much has changed, okay? We might be going around thinking we're cool with our iPhones and stuff like that in society nowadays, but really and truly not that much has changed. And anyone that's suffering from this, because I read a shocking statistic about how low the percentage is of rape cases in Ireland that actually end up in court.
Yeah.
And that's because, yet again, shame.
Yeah. And family related abuse is the highest rated in Ireland.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. It's
unreal.
absolutely shocking. It's absolutely shocking. Well, Fiona, thank you so much. And
welcome.
this was an absolutely very, very strong interview, and you're a very, very brave lady. And I think that not only are you telling your story, but you're telling other people's story here today.
Sadly,
and maybe those people can stand up now and come forward, and we would urge you to do that. So thanks so much, Fiona.
You're welcome.